Hello and welcome. In today's explainer, we are diving into a really interesting online text. It asks one of the biggest questions in history. Who exactly was Jesus? But here's the thing. This source doesn't really treat it like a question. It makes a very bold claim, and then, almost like a lawyer, it builds a case, piece by piece, using scripture as its evidence. So let's unpack how they do it.
Right off the bat, the source material just lays it all out there. It opens with this exact question, putting it front and center. It's not trying to ease you in. For this author, this is it, the fundamental question that everything else hinges on. And what's so striking about the approach here is that there's zero ambiguity. This isn't some philosophical journey exploring different possibilities. Nope, the text is making a definitive statement and then spending the rest of the time trying to prove it. So, this is really the heart of the matter. On one hand, you have these common views of Jesus as a great teacher, a prophet, maybe just a historical man. But the source text, it rejects all of that. It argues for something way, way bigger, that Jesus is literally God in a human body and the one and only path to salvation.
And there it is. This is the main thesis of the whole piece, and it's stated almost like a command. This is the central idea, the foundation that the entire argument is built on. So the big question for us is, how does the author even begin to back this up?
Well, the strategy is pretty clear. The argument is built almost entirely on evidence pulled directly from Christian scripture. The author goes in and handpicks specific verses, laying them out in a logical order to show that this isn't just their opinion. It's a conclusion they believe is backed up by the holy text itself. Okay, so the author kicks off the evidence portion of their case with a verse from the book of 1 Timothy. Let's take a look at the exact text they chose to lead with. So this verse from 1 Timothy is presented as Exhibit A. And that line, God was manifested in the flesh, that is everything. It's a direct, punchy statement that serves as the first major pillar for the whole argument. And here's how the source text seems to interpret this. It's almost like a short biography. The opening line, God was manifested in the flesh, is the birth of the idea. And the rest of the lines, they're seen as a chronological journey of this divine being on earth, from being seen by angels to being preached about around the world, and finally, returning to glory. Now, to really double down on this point, the author brings in a second piece of evidence. This one is from the book of Colossians, and it introduces a really key theological term, the Godhead. Now, this verse is used to argue something really specific. It's not just that Jesus is divine, but that the entirety, the complete fullness of God's nature is right there in his physical body. That word fullness is absolutely critical to the author's point. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the logic. It's a super simple three-step argument. 1, there is a Godhead, the essence of God. 2, all of its fullness, not just a piece of it, is inside Jesus. And 3, it's there bodily, in a physical, real-world way. Okay, so the argument then pivots a little. It moves from the what to the how and why. Why would a divine being take on a human form in the first place? For that, the author points us to a passage from Philippians to talk about this idea of divine humility. This bit is chosen to really hammer home the idea of a conscious choice. The source interprets this as a being who is already in the form of God and then willingly chose to give it up and humble himself. So this passage is used to set up two really big ideas. First, a baseline of divinity, being equal with God. And second, this voluntary act of coming down from that, becoming human, and humbling himself all the way to death. All right, the last piece of evidence from the traditional Bible comes from the very beginning of the Gospel of John. And it uses this really powerful symbolic term, the Word. The source puts these two lines right next to each other to draw this incredibly direct link. Step 1, the Word was God. Step 2, the Word became flesh. For the author, it doesn't get much clearer than that. It's one of the most poetic and direct statements supporting their whole claim. Now, after building this case with 4 passages from the accepted biblical canon, the author does something really interesting. They pull in a piece of evidence from a completely different type of source. So before we even look at the quote, we got to understand what apocrypha means. Basically, these are ancient writings that for a bunch of historical and theological reasons aren't included in the official canon of the Bible. And to be fair, the author is totally upfront about this. The specific text they cite is called the First Book of Adam and Eve, which, as you might guess, tells stories about Adam and Eve after they left the Garden of Eden.
In this particular passage, God is talking to Adam and Eve about some future sacrifice, and the author of our source text looks at this and sees a direct parallel, a foreshadowing of the life and purpose of Jesus.
And just in case you are wondering how they interpret that quote, they don't leave any room for doubt. They followed up with this super direct statement. This is talking about Jesus. They're basically using this non-canonical text as extra supporting evidence for their argument. So, after laying out all the evidence from the Bible, from the Apocrypha, the text ends with this really powerful call to action. It kind of reframes the whole thing. Belief isn't just an option, it's presented as the only logical and deserved response to all the proof they've laid out.
So let's just quickly recap the structure of this argument. It starts with a huge question, gives a definitive answer right away, and then builds its case piece by piece using scripture, even pulling from apocryphal texts, before wrapping up with this strong, emotional plea.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? No matter what the topic is, watching how an argument gets built, the evidence someone chooses, the logic they use, the conclusion they draw, it's just a really powerful way to understand different viewpoints. Why this evidence? Why put it in this order? It's a fascinating peek into the art of persuasion itself.